I am, you are, we are the direct beneficiary of a host of people who've lived faithfully in normal times and incredibly trying times. We are all prisoners of the moment to some degree. We are in the middle of a rather difficult year, 2020. And in the middle of that, this is all we think about. We think about the deadlines. We think about all the things that happen to us. Where am I working this week? In the office or at home? Where's school this week? In school or at home? What's my schedule like? What do I have to do? So many more things to juggle. And our own issues become large. And soon that's all we think about. My issues, my thing, just for today. But we do not exist alone. This week I saw online someone said, if 2020 was a GIF, one of those moving little things on Facebook, what would it look like? And immediately it was just filled with a guy falling off a ladder, someone sitting on a lawn chair that collapses, someone slipping on the ice, all kind of things representing this year. Sometimes we need to remember that we do not exist alone. We're part of something bigger than ourselves. All of us are part of a generation of a family that stretches back for centuries. Some of you have done the work. Some of you can tell you who your grandparents were, great-grandparents were, and great-grandparents were. I can only go back so far. I can only go back to about the Civil War. I think my wife's family can go back further. Every generation of pictures looks like the cast of The Godfather, but that's a whole different thing. And the last names match. We're also part of a 2,000-year-old tradition of faith. And even in the midst of a difficult year, if I were to ask anyone, if you could go to any time and place in history, any place, and ask where would you like to be born, any time period in which you'd like to be born, you'd be hard-pressed to find a better time than still right here and right now. Because we just don't think about things that other people have had to. So in this Thanksgiving week, I thought I'd do something completely different. I thought I might pull out a few names and introduce you to people who share our heritage. Some of these names you might know. But others, many, you might not. The author of Hebrews wrote to a church experiencing not only hardship, but disillusionment. So in chapter 11, the author of Hebrews reminds them of all these people that have had an impact on their life that came before. You're familiar with this chapter. It says, by faith, Enoch, by faith, Abel, by faith, Noah, by faith, Abraham, and kept going down the list. Until we arrive at chapter 12. And the author of Hebrews says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And you have forgotten the word of encouragement that addresses you as children of God. Let me give you some of the people in our heritage that we might need to be reminded of today. Let me start off by a name that you all know very well, John Wesley. John Wesley was a church leader and reformer in the 1700s. He traveled extensively, largely through Great Britain, but he even made, I think, about a 2-year journey through the United States. He landed in Savannah, Georgia, and went through Georgia for a while. When he went out and preached, he would rarely go from church to church. He would rather stop and just start preaching outside, because his concern was he wanted to reach the greatest number of people possible. And contrary to most of the other voices in his day, especially a Reverend Whitfield you might have heard about, Wesley believed that all people are the focus of God's grace. And anyone who believes can be redeemed. Anyone. He also believed that God does not leave us alone where He finds us, and that His grace can transform people. And if we'll allow Him, we'll become more and more and more like Christ. Wesley also had noticed the cold, perfunctory religion of his day, and one day through while reading through an introduction to the book of Romans, he felt his heart, in his words, strangely warmed. And he stressed that one can experience the presence of God in our lives. And he stressed holy living and personal accountability. He not only thought that God's grace can transform a person, but entire families and cultures. In 1774, Wesley began overtly preaching against slavery. His influence was the key reason that slavery became illegal in Britain, and the key reason for the starting of the abolitionist movement here in the United States. And Wesley also supported this strange idea that not just the people in front should be ministers of the gospel, but everyone has a role in ministering the gospel to our culture. We each can introduce people to Jesus Christ. His influence started the Methodist Church, and his influence most strongly lives today in churches just like this one. We claim to be Wesleyan. The next name is one that you probably haven't heard too much about. His name is George Mueller. I was attracted to him because of the beard. I think I'm going to start one just like it. In 1832, he decided that he was going to reach out. I think he originally started, he was trying to reach Jewish people living in London. I don't know why that didn't go well or what the reason was, but he found himself in Bristol, England, and he noticed that there's a lot of young people and kids who exist in culture and never had a chance to go to school. So he decided, I'll start a school. And every student that comes, I'm going to give a Bible to, and we're going to have reading. We're going to teach them reading the Scripture and philosophy and all that sort of thing. So he started his first school in 1834 in Bristol. By 1 year later, he'd already opened 5. He never received any government support. It wouldn't have happened in that day anyway. And he made a promise that he would never ask anybody to give. He would only accept unsolicited gifts. At the end of his life, he had distributed over 285,000 Bibles and over 1.4 million New Testaments. He cared for 10,024 orphans in the orphanage that he started. And he eventually established 117 schools that educated over 120,000 people in his lifetime. That was never his goal. He never started off by saying, this is what I'm going to do. He just moved to fill a need when he saw the need, and somehow the world changed. And by the way, in an era before there was any airplanes, at the end of his life, he had traveled over 200,000 miles to support his vision and the good that he did. The next name, some of you might be familiar with. His name is Eric Liddell. Eric Liddell was one of the leading sprinters of his day. And in the early 1920s, he was the favorite, or one of the favorites, to win the gold medal in the Olympic Games held in 1924 in Paris, France. He was on the Great Britain sprinting team, and his best event was the 100 meters. And when he got to the Olympics, he was disheartened when he saw that the qualifying heats for the 100-meter dash were going to be held on a Sunday. One thing about Eric was a very devout Christian and said, I'm not going to work, nor am I going to sprint on Sunday. You might have seen this story in the 1980 movie Chariots of Fire. He pulled out of the Olympics in the 100-meter dash and concentrated all his energies on the 400-meter dash, which was not his best event, and he was not favored at all to win, just being also ran. Well, he ended up winning the 400-meter dash in the 1924 Olympic Games. And we've seen that story in the movie. Here's the part of the story we don't know too much about. few years after the Olympics, Mr. Liddell went to China to be one of the first missionaries there. And he started a mission work in China, which was going fine for a while, but then around 1937, it wasn't even called World War II at that point. It was called Japan invaded China and overran the village where he was. And so, along with most of the other civilians from the town he was in, Eric Liddell was placed in a Japanese-run civilian internment camp. Now, while I just said at the beginning, there's not many places and times you would rather be if you could choose than this one. There are not many places you'd rather not be in human history than a Japanese-run civilian internment camp, and that's where Eric Liddell found himself. He never stopped serving others. He quickly became a leader in the camp, encouraged others all the time, and was looked at as a guide by the rest. Before the war ended, I think it was not late 1944, he died in that very same prison camp, largely from the effects of malnourishment. His death devastated the entire facility, including some of the Japanese captors. We are living in difficult times, but we cannot imagine a civilian labor camp administered by the Japanese. That was Eric Liddell. Some of you will know this name, Wernher von Braun. Wernher von Braun was a brilliant young German scientist. He was getting his master's degree, which he got in 1932 in Germany, and he was getting his master's degree in this new field called rocketry. He had studied and he was experimenting with rockets. Not just shooting them up like we used to do when we were kids, and then we'd chase the rocket on the bike, a little parachute come out, we'd chase it and do it all over again. He actually believed in 1932 that it was possible to shoot a rocket and guide it in outer space and do planetary travel with the use of rockets. That was just considered crazy. In 1934, he got his PhD in physics, and his work continued. The problem is, in 1934, a guy by the name of Adolf Hitler had assumed control of Germany. And von Braun's work was now being converted into military applications. I don't know whether he initially supported or just got consumed in his work, but in the middle of the war, he was arrested. He was arrested for not being supportive of Hitler and expressing reservations about him. But after less than a month, he was deemed too important, and he was released as long as he kept up his work. That rocket technology became the V-2 rocket, which terrorized London and other cities in Britain late in the war. Here's what we don't know. Early in 1945, von Braun arranged for his team of nearly 500 people to move from northern Germany to southwestern Germany. He said he could do better research there. He said the facilities were better. Privately, he told people, the war's going badly. I want to be able to surrender to the Americans. One morning, after moving, he was on his bicycle on his way to work, and he saw an American private. He jumped off his bike, ran to him with his hands in the air, saying, "I am von Braun, inventor of the V-2. I want to surrender," which is a surprise to the private. Happily, the United States arranged for von Braun and 100 of his handpicked associates to move to the United States and set up all his research facilities here. That research eventually led to the Saturn V rocket and the moon landings, and the space shuttle and a bunch of other stuff. Here's a part you really don't know. In 1946, one of the first places he was sent to was El Paso, Texas, to Fort Bliss. Throughout his younger years, von Braun did not show signs of any religious activity or an interest at all. In fact, he was known to his friends as a merry heathen, a fröhlicher Heide. There you go, there's a little German for the day. And a bit of a womanizer. Nevertheless, in 1945, he told people his decision to surrender to the Western Allies was influenced by his desire to share rocket technology with people who followed the Bible. I don't know where that started with him. In 1946, he attended a little church in El Paso, Texas, and underwent a religious conversion to Christianity. In a magazine a few years later, he said, "One day a neighbor called and asked if I would like to go to church with him. I accepted, because I wanted to see if the American church was just a country club like I'd been led to expect. Instead, I found a small white frame building in the hot Texas sun on a browned out lot. Together, these people made a live and vibrant community, and this was the first time I ever understood that Christianity was not a cathedral inherited from the past or a prayer to be offered at the last minute of life. I learned it was a living religion backed up by discipline and effort. That's von Braun. His later years, he was a committed Christian who saw the necessity of both science and faith, and he endured some ridicule from other people, other scientists, for his outspoken Christianity. He supported Christianity, and later members of his family even became leaders of nationwide international mission organizations, all because he got out of Germany and surrendered to the one side, and it led to a change. Here's another name I get probably most of you don't know, Richard Wurmbrand. He was a Romanian. Very bright, good student. So they thought they'd train him in the top communist school to be a future communist leader. But just before he finished his training, he suddenly dropped out, which was surprising to the authorities. Even more surprising is when he showed up a little bit later, publicly denouncing communism and preaching the gospel on street corners in Romania. By the way, in 1960-something, there's not many more dangerous things you could do than that. As a result, he was arrested and jailed for almost 9 years. He was abused, tortured, burned, and the soles of his feet were beaten down to the bone. A humanitarian group paid Romania $10,000 in 1964 for his release. Romania accepted the money and figured his experience and his beatings and his torture would sideline Richard. And they were spectacularly wrong. He started a group called the Voice of the Martyrs in 1967, a group that highlighted and distributed information about the trials of the underground persecuted church worldwide. And in the 80s, his group was a key group in undermining, leading to the downfall of communism. In recent years, this former fugitive from Romania was voted 5th on the list of greatest Romanians of all time. That's Richard. This one, you're probably very familiar with. His name's Francis Collins. He's an American geneticist who discovered the genes associated with a number of diseases and led what's called the Human Genome Project, mapping our entire DNA helix for the first time. There are people out here that know what that means. I'm not one of them. He's director of the National Institutes of Health in the United States. Before being appointed director, he led the Human Genome Project, and as a result of his research, the genes responsible for these diseases have been identified, and treatments have and are being developed. As a result of that, one of those treatments is the current COVID vaccine that's about to be debuted. By graduate school, Francis considered himself an avowed atheist, as anyone with his training and knowledge, of course, should be. However, a conversation with a hospital patient led him to question this absence of religious views. He investigated various faiths. He familiarized himself with the evidence for and against God. And at the recommendation of a Methodist pastor, used Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis as a foundation in developing his religious views. He believed that people cannot be converted to Christianity just by reason and argument alone, but that the final step for all of us includes a leap of faith, even the director of the Human Genome Project. After several years of deliberation, he converted to Christianity during a trip to the Cascade Mountains, where he described a striking image of a frozen waterfall. And something about that removed his final resistance to faith, resulting in his conversion. And by the way, not everybody experiences conversion the same way, thankfully. He now describes himself as a serious and committed Christian. In his own words, he has said, the God of the Bible is also the God of the genome. God can be worshipped in the cathedral or in the laboratory. His creation is majestic, awesome, intricate, and beautiful. And God is most certainly not threatened in the least by science, because God made it all possible. That's Francis Collins. Those are some big names from the past. And I'm sure that all of you have your names. So let me just share a couple of my names in this tradition. There's a gentleman named Dwight Milliken. Dwight Milliken was pastor of Decatur, Illinois, Church of Nazarene for 8 or 9 years. Until 1978. And I think in like February of 1978, he came to Marion, Ohio to pastor my church. It was about May. He'd only been pastor about 3 months. It was May of that year. It was after church on a Sunday morning. He came up to me. I didn't approach him. I wasn't asking for it. He came up to me and he said, "Son, do you mow lawns?" And I said, "Well, yes." And he goes, "Would you like to mow mine?" And I must have had a blank stare. He goes, "And I will pay you for it." And I went, "The answer is yes." He didn't have that big a lawn, and I don't know what led him to just come to me, and I would mow his lawn. And after a few, then he would say, "Come on inside, I have some lemonade," and we'd chat a little bit. Maybe a month or so went by, and one night he says, "Hey, let me show you something. See this?" He handed me. He goes, "I'm having a board meeting tonight. That's what I do. This is the agenda. This is my report. This is the church budget. Here's how we do things." He started taking me down through these kind of things. We started having other conversations. Pretty soon September came and the lawn need to be mowed. And in October, one morning, Dwight Milliken went to bed and he didn't wake up. He just had a heart attack and died in the night. And I heard people say, "Oh, that's too bad. He was only there 8 months. He couldn't really accomplish anything in 8 months." I disagree. I think he did. I had the very privilege of living next door to a woman named Mabel McCorder, who happened to be my grandmother, who in her lifetime, in my lifetime, I never heard her say one negative thing about any other human being, including my dad. She was always kind. The worst thing I heard her say was about my dad. This was the worst thing. And by the way, if my grandma said this about you, you'd go crawl in the corner somewhere and assume the fetal position. She said, "I just don't think your father lived quite up to the potential that he had." That's the worst thing I ever heard. And a lot of us had the experience of coming into church for years and being greeted first by a very small-statured little old lady in her 70s, 80s, and eventually 90s, named Evelyn Thompson, who wasn't rich, probably got her Social Security check, didn't have money. There's not a single person on the planet who would have said she's a person of influence. I disagree. Because with faith, we can be made more than we ever thought possible. I'm going to have one last name. John Cotner. Some of you might know who John Cotner is. John Cotner used to be academic vice president, academic dean at Olivet Nazarene University. There were some issues in the 70s and he stepped down, and there's a lot of people who think they know the story of why he stepped down. I guarantee you, you don't know the story. I absolutely guarantee you, you don't. John had retired to Marshall, Texas, and I was a 26, 27-year-old kid who was pastoring Marshall, Texas. And the first thing I got to know him a little bit. I told him, I said, "John, I want you to do me a favor." He goes, "Sure, I'll help in any way." I said, "Here's what I want you to do. I want you to meet me every Monday morning at 8 a.m. for breakfast." He goes, "All right." And I said, "And during that breakfast, I want you to ruthlessly critique everything I said on Sunday morning. Critique my prayer, critique my sermon, critique the thought process, critique the grammar. I mean, tear it apart." He goes, "I can't do that." I go, "But I want you to do that." So we eventually agreed. And the first couple of weeks, Dr. Cotner just wasn't understanding it because he was trying to be nice. I told him, I don't want you to be nice. He warmed to the task. One Sunday, apparently I had prayed. I'll tell this story about me. I had prayed, and I go, what'd you notice yesterday? And he goes, well, Doug, listen, Doug, I noticed, Doug, that in the church service, Doug, that, sometimes, Doug, when you talk, Doug, and I went, all right, what are you getting at? And he said, when you prayed? I said, yes. He said, do you think God's deaf? Do you think God doesn't know his name? You tell people all the time that when you pray, it just should be a conversation with God like he's there in the room, and yet the way you talked was different than how you talk to other people in the room. I went, whoa. I'm just an example of what he did when he warmed to the task. After about 2 years, I started hearing talk about the Yankee pastor and all the new people in church. There was a lot of new people in church. Church had almost doubled in size, but most of the new people were not from Marshall, Texas. They were living there, but from other parts of the country, and people didn't like that too much. And so John started talking to me about other things, and his influence was unmistakable. We are the direct beneficiary of a host of people who've lived faithfully in normal times and incredibly trying times. Some of these have accomplished great things, and others are just, as if just should even be included here, incredibly faithful, and that faithfulness has made all the difference. Our world needs a new generation to step up. But that call is often met by people who will try to find time to respond to faith, or are consumed by other concerns. I think it would be perfectly good if when we read Hebrews 11, if we read it a little differently. By faith, Abraham. By faith, Isaac. By faith, Joseph. By faith, Moses. By faith, Mabel. By faith, Evelyn. By faith, Dr. Kottner. Since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, may we throw off anything that hinders and anything that so easily entangles, and let us fix our eyes on Jesus.